Walleyes in current on flies is one of my favorite ways to catch a fish. Today I'm going to show you how I tie them up, how I rig them up, how I fish them, and what they look like underwater. Let's get started. You can easily make your own walleye flies with just a little bit of overhead. All you're going to need is a fly tying vise, some fly tying thread, scissors, hooks, head cement, a little resin to finish off the fly, and of course your bucktail and a little bit of flash for some extra attractant. Here's how I tie mine. This is my go-to hook right here, number 4 Aberdeen Fusion 19. I leave a little shank exposed, and you'll see why when we get down to the rigging spot. So I start back, and you see how when you wrap, now you wrap back over the tag end, back down the shank a few times, put a little cement, and wrap back up to about there. Now, I usually do a flash core on the inside, and the bucktail we're tying is so sparse anyways, there's plenty of visibility. So actually let's do gold. We're just going to snip a couple of strands of gold, and we're going to fold it back over the line like this to begin wrapping them in place. So something like this. And back up. That's it. Now to the front. We're wrapping our way up to the front, and here I'm just going to wrap a little bulge of thread here so that as I start wrapping my bucktail, the thread won't want to travel past that little nub as easy. I lock that in with a little more cement. If you do this on the front end, your fly could last you a few more fish on the back end. Now for our bucktail selection, I've got 4 basic colors here that I have a lot of confidence in: purple, red, black, and green. And you can mix and match all 4 of those colors with each other, and they'll be fish catchers. Don't overthink it. When you're cutting your bucktails, you're going to snip them from the back here, not up here. So you just pull a small little section. Don't use too much hair. Just a small little section like that is all you need. And the stuff you're using is the stuff up here, because now you've got a natural taper of bucktail up here, and that's how you kind of get that nice streamline effect on the fly. So we're just going to snip. The further up you go on the bucktail, the finer the bucktail is, but I'll just take a little piece right about here, and we've got our little piece of hair. How long do I like to make my bucktail? Usually from the head where I'm tying to the bend of the hook, I'll about double it. So something like that. So now I'll just cut that off at the base there. And we'll wrap this in. Actually, let's make purple go on the bottom here. I'm going to make a black back. Purple and black today. So we're just going to secure these in. Like that. It's not super taut yet, so you still have some little bit of wiggle room to kind of smash that bucktail around to make sure that you get even distribution on the bottom half of the fly. But that looks pretty good. Just kind of lock it in, and there's your bottom. Now let's do our top portion of the fly. So what we're doing, black. So again, we'll just measure out a little chunk of black. Now we'll measure this out here. That looks good, so I'll cut it, and we will tie this into the top. Lay it right there. Give it a couple wraps. Don't go super tight yet, because you want to be able to work that bucktail around for that even distribution around the fly. That looks good just right there. Now we'll make our nose here and wrap around. And that looks pretty good. Again, do you see how there's just not much hair on this fly? Less is best. You want kind of a minimal amount of hair on there. Just let that thing float around naturally. You'd be amazed at how many fish still want to come and slurp this up. So now let's hit it with a little head cement. Now you don't need a whip finish tool. You can just tie some half hitches with your thread, but I use a whip finish tool to finish it off. To do a whip finish, you bring it underneath, you go back over, and you flip it. So now you got a figure 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pull it tight. There you go. Snip that. Another little bit of head cement on there. This water-based stuff is pretty cool. You can see where you're putting it and you can see it soak in. And then when it dries, it's perfectly clear. Let that dry a second. While we're letting this dry here, let's trim up our tinsel. You should keep it, actually we're gonna go 3 pieces of tinsel, not 4. So let's trim one all the way off. And then we'll trim these a little shorter. And then I like to leave a little bloodline on there from my thread. Now let's finish this up. We just need our UV finishing resin. Put a little dab of that on there. Something like that. Hit it with your UV light. And we're done. So there is literally all you need to get bit in a river. There's not much hair there. Sometimes I put a little bit more on there, but honestly, that will catch a fish when I go out on the water. There's just not much there, and that's the way I like it. See that? Most important thing, I left a little bit of a shank on here. That way when I go to snell my line through the hook, I've got enough shank for that line to grab onto, just like if you were tying on a crawler harness hook. That's what I kind of do different than what I see in other flies being tied. And I will show you the reason I do that once we get out to the shop. Here is a quick crash course on how I like to rig up my flies for casting in current. Let's start with the rod, and we'll work our way down to the rig. The 2 rods that I like to use are both over 7 foot in length. You can use any rod you want, but the little bit longer rod helps keep your line off the surface of the water when you're twitching. It helps keep pumping those flies and picking them up off bottom so that they're always just barely above bottom as you're working your way through the cast. You do want a little bit of a lighter tip, and these 2 JT rods here are what I prefer, a 7-1 and a 7-9. My very favorite handle to use is this Tennessee handle, and the reason for that is I actually put the reel a little bit further back on the reel seat so that I can hold it up and use my reel as a counterbalance, just so I can get some nice sharp little twitches in my retrieve as I'm pumping it across the current. The tip, that nice little bit lighter tip, it's great for when you're coming up and you contact that sinker. It's not jolting that sinker off the bottom. It gives you that little bit of a cushion so that you're just barely nudging that sinker, which is imparting that little bit of a nudge into the fly. So they're just doing that. You'll figure out, what the fish are in the mood for. They might be just in for a lazy sway in the current, and they might want some extra little pops in there too. But you'll figure that out. Just start with a nice little twitch every now and again as it's carrying downstream, and you'll be good. So let's work our way down the line here. Speaking of line, I like thin braid for my main line. 6 pound is what I use. Usually a Suffix 832 or 131 is what I prefer for my main line. And then we get down to our 3-way swivel, and that's going to have a leader going back to the flies and a dropper lead going down to the sinker. For my leader materials, I like to use monofilament. This one here is McCoy Mean Green, and I like P-Line CXX. It's a stiffer monofilament, and I'll use that in 6 and 8 pound test as well. If there's really good light penetration in the water, This little bit of a greened out line is nice because it takes some of that sheen away. I don't think the fish care, but if you care, I like the green mono for that. Mono over fluorocarbon for me, just for its natural floating ability in the water, is what I prefer, and that's why I use mono. It just helps carry those flies off bottom as it's sweeping through the current a little bit better. Most guys use between 6 and 10 pound test for their leader material. So for my fly leader material, I usually use about an arm pull and then a little bit extra. And that's another reason for using the 7+ foot length rods, is so as you reel your 3-way swivel up to the tip, you've got plenty of room to secure your flies down by the reel seat. For your dropper, you're gonna need a pencil sinker or a jig head, whatever you wanna use. And I usually use a little snap or a quick connect clip, just so I can easily swap weights or take weights off if it's time to run and I don't want them bouncing around and tangling all over the place. Let's tie up a rig real quick. I've got 2 variations on how I tie my flies to the leader. One is in line and they're both snelled at that point. The other one is a snelled one in the back and a T-loop connector on the front. So I will show you both of those methods and explain why you would want to use either one or the other. And I also have some underwater footage to show you how they behave in the water if you want to see if there's any differences in how those flies behave. They both catch fish. It's not a make or break deal. Don't get caught up in all the little technicalities of this. As you start to get confidence in this program, you'll start to figure out the little things that make a difference for you as you're fishing them. But the most important thing is just to have a basic arsenal, a basic rig, lob it out there in some fishy areas, and start getting some confidence in it. I like to tie 2 flies in line with each other. Some guys do 3. Here's how I like to tie mine on. See how there's some exposed shank on that hook? I tie my streamers further back so that I can snell it. If you've ever snelled a crawler harness for walleyes before, you do it the exact same way. You put your line up through it, and you wrap 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times maybe. And then you take your line and you put it through the top of the hook. And you pull it tight. Cinch it down pretty good. You don't want that coming unraveled, just like a crawler harness. And we'll give it a snip. So now I have a snelled fly for my rear hook. And that's going to go on the back. And now I'm going to go up to whatever I want to the front to make my next knot. So here's where I have 2 different variations of where I tie mine on. You can choose to snell another one on, which is real quick and easy, and it gets bit. So if you wanted to do it that way, now you're going to come in from the top of that hook, kind of position it to where you want behind this hook. So that's a good distance there. Usually like 12 to, 14 inches apart, something like that. Now I'm just going to do the same thing. Wrap back, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, something like that. Tie this on, come in from the top. And like if I'm ever in a hurry to tie 2 on, there isn't a faster way to make a 2-fly rig. So now I've got 2 flies in line with each other. So we've got fly number 1 and fly number 2 all in line, and they're both snelled. So that's the beauty of leaving a little bit of exposed shank on that hook. Now here's why I like to have a snelled hook. When you start to come in contact with a fish, you've got that line coming underneath that eye, which is putting additional upward leverage on that hook, driving that hook home. And once you bury that hook, it's got excellent holding power to keep that fish buttoned up. It's not pulling at a weird angle directly off the tip of that hook, which can result in a hook pulling free. So I would say your hooking percentage and your landing percentage does go up if you have it on a snell. The thing is, it might look a little funny hanging there, like it's almost a little crooked, but at the same time, when you're twitching this underwater, that little offset like that actually gives it a little bit of a kick. It's just a real subtle kick, almost like a little jerkbait scoot, before you let it settle back in with the current. And that's a really cool look to the fly as well. And it doesn't hurt. You'll still get bit, and you've just increased your hookup and landing ratios by snelling the hook. So that's why I do that. The other way I tie them on, and I'll use 8-pound for this. First, we're going to snell our rear hook on again, just like we did before. So now we're going to come up to about where we want it for our next one. So something like that. We'll mark it. Now we'll slide up a little bit more. Now we're going to take our fingers and roll the line in the same direction as we bundle this loop together, and just keep rolling, keep rolling, keep rolling. You see how we're building up a twisted loop here? That's going to be our T section. So you can make this as long as you want. There's no right or wrong way to do it. It does whatever you end up with, it'll probably get bit. So once you've created your twists in the line like that, now we're just going to make a series of overhand knots in the base portion of this loop. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now we're going to take the loop that we made, our T loop, and stick it through the loop that we just made. And gently pull it together. Let's see if you can see that happening. Pulling it together, just like that. Now we've got a T loop. So now it's time to attach a fly. To do that is real easy. You can take any fly, even a standard tied fly you can use for this because it doesn't take up any room on the shank. So you can see here, I have put, I've taken that T knot and I've put it up through the fly. Now I'll take this loop and just bring the fly through there. Oops, pull that hair off. And tighten it up. There we go. So now we've attached our second fly. So check this out. Now, when it's sitting there in the current, this fly stays off of the main line, and it's kind of its own attachment point. So this will be sitting in the current like this. When you twitch it, you'll see it jolt through the water a little bit differently. It has its own float separate from the rear one. So they each kind of have their own independent action at that point. And there's not much risk of tangling or anything like that, because what that T-loop does is it adds, those twists add some stiffness as it comes out from the main line. The other benefit of having all those little micro twists in the T-loop, you make that line even thicker now. So the thicker your line, the more water resistance it has on the stroke, which creates more lift and buoyancy or float to the entire rig. It does help keep everything off bottom a little bit better by adding all those extra twists, because you just have that much more surface area hitting the line, which helps you, especially in some snaggy areas, keep this just off bottom. So now we're going to tie that to our 3-way swivel, and now we're going to add a dropper. So I have 8-pound test for my main line. I'm going to go 6-pound test for my dropper. That way if I hook one of the many trees in the river I'm headed to, I can just lose a sinker. Your dropper line should be anywhere from 6 to 12 inches. 10 inches is a good starting point. So you don't have to have too fancy a knots to attach this, because it's a sacrificial component to the whole rig anyways. So there's one. Now on the bottom portion of this dropper, I like to attach a little quick loop thingy here, just to easily attach or swap out different weights. You can use a cross-lock snap. You can use anything or just tie on a sinker. It don't really matter. So there it is. You've got your 3-way swivel going to an arm's length lead of flies, one in front of the other. This one was with the T-loop connection. The other one was inline. They'll both catch fish, front and back. Those fish don't seem to mind too much. And it changes. Sometimes you do see a preference. You keep getting fish on the same fly. Maybe it's a color preference. Maybe it's an action preference. Maybe it's a total coincidence. You never know. But that's, if you're getting feedback on getting bit in a certain way, you've got two different options. You know, if they're all coming on the back, maybe tie the other one in line up front and see if that changes. But some days they really like that front one too, for whatever reason. And it could just be total coincidence too. Now you tie that to your rod and you're done. You've got a rig. So when I'm going from spot to spot, this could be, this one reason I like to have that quick connect clip is I'll detach my sinker, but then to stow my flies, well, if you've got a long rod like this 7/9, you can just hook it in the hook keeper like normal, or to keep both flies tamed, you can hook one fly into the other like this, tighten up, and you're ready to go to the next spot. If you have it sitting overnight like this, sometimes you'll notice a kink in your monofilament as you go to start fishing for the next day. So all you got to do is just take your finger, smooth out your line, give it a stretch, kill all that memory that was in your line, so you've got a nice straight rig ready to fish. But that's all there is to it for these flies. Now let's talk about how I like to fish these flies real quick, because I think boat positioning and where you're focusing the better portion of each cast is just as important, if not more important, than trying to tie up the perfect fly rig. If you're in and amongst fish and you're just subtly twitching any variation of what I just did, you'll catch fish. All right, let's talk casts and boat positioning real quick. So let's pretend the current, this is the river, the current's flowing down. So if I'm gonna pin up my boat, and I'm standing right here, I'll usually make a cast out, across current, and let that fly naturally swing to the back of the boat. But there's definitely a sweet spot where you get most of your bites, and that's right here. So you can cast out and let that current bring it back. But once you get to about here, now every time you stroke it, you're kind of making a sideways tack with your fly as it's coming in to get centered behind the boat, where it naturally is gonna get carried eventually anyways. So you're casting out here, tap, 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 and it's working its way into this sweet zone. And the reason I like this area the most is you just have the ultimate control. Every time you tap it, it's not getting carried that much. It's just, it's more or less getting just tacked sideways in the current with each tap. So this is kind of the zone I like to do that. And with that in mind, your boat position and where you set up to make your cast is pretty critical. So let me draw out a little scenario, two scenarios that I have for you. There's our river. With this bend in the river right here, and if the current's coming down, the current's going to be coming off of this bank, hitting this point right here, and continuing out into the river channel a little bit. So what that actually does is it creates a seam off of that bank. And so you've got a faster current here, you've got a slower current on the inside where that water didn't actually, catch the bank. So this seam right here is a concentration point. So now you have to try to position your boat so that you can work that fly in the sweet spot of where it wants to be when it gets to this concentration point, because that's typically the area that's holding a lot of the fish. So it's not always just a seam. I mean, it could be a break line. There could be a rock pile sitting right here that you want to try and target. There could be, if there's a deep hole in the river right here, and the fish are kind of holding at the head of that deep hole, you want to be able to position your boat so that when you cast out, by the time it swings into the sweet area, remember this area here? By the time it sets up there, you're directly in those fish. So you're going to pin up, you're going to spot lock, and you're going to maybe jog back and forth a little bit and make a couple practice casts so that by the time your bait is right where it's really happy, you're bringing your bait, you're bringing that rig right through the high percentage zone where you should be getting bit. So line up your boat so that your cast is lined up with the high percentage portion of that cast to be most effective when you're trying to do this technique. If you're just on a big flat and there's fish coming up through the whole thing, another thing you can do instead of just pinning up is you can just put your autopilot on forward, but just enough power so that you're just barely slipping back against the current. You know, I could have my boat here and I could put it on forward motion going against the current, but just fast enough so that I'm slowly slipping downstream. That way, by the time I'm off this back corner of the boat and fishing, it's basically like an extended cast and you're covering a bunch of water until you finally start to connect with a herd of fish. And as soon as you connect with a fish, hit spot lock and then start to set up repetitive casts right through there, because especially in the springtime or anytime fish are starting to become concentrated or moving around in packs, flies are absolutely the best way to extract as many fish as possible out of a small area with minimal effort. It's easier than fishing a jig. It's easier than trying to, make constant trolling passes through a spot. If you've got fish penned up somewhere, there's not many better ways to extract them than casting a fly and twitching those flies right through them. So I hope this helps. We're going to go out into the water and I will show you exactly how I do it. But that's kind of the down and dirty of the fly technique. My buddy Mark O'Brien showed me this many years ago, and we were making pass after pass over this one rock pile pulling flies, and obviously we kept catching fish on one particular spot of that rock pile, so eventually we just pinned up in front of the rock pile and started lobbing rigs at it, and we didn't have to move. We just kept plucking them off one after another, and since then, I live right up the street from the Rock River, and that has an amazing fly pattern bite pretty much all year long, but especially in the spring, in the fall, in the colder water periods. It's just a really awesome way to connect with fish. So I hope this helps you. Feel free to shoot me any questions if you've got any, but don't overthink this technique. Figure out, the weight that you're going to be using based on the depth and the sweep, and we'll get into all that when we get on the water, but this should help, should give you a good start. Get out there, get some confidence in that hair, and enjoy this time on the water, guys. I'll talk to you next time. See ya.